So welcome everyone to the 2018 presentations of the Student Fellows of the Humanities Seminar. I'm Nels Pearson, Director of the Humanities Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you out today to hear these wonderful presentations by students who have been working all year on these projects. And I wanted to just briefly give a thanks to my Associate Directors, Patricia Berry, Patricia who is in charge of the seminar, and also Geraldine Johnson from Department of Modern Languages and Literatures, and also our hardworking backbone of the whole thing, Elizabeth Hastings, who is our program coordinator and who's in the back working handing out programs, who none of this happens without her, and also to Mara Dutoy, who is our graduate assistant, who has been working also alongside these students all year and who's with us today. And thank you very much, Mara, for that. And also to Ron Davidson, who is our inaugural director and who has surprised us with his presence today. He's been circling the globe from parts east to parts south to parts west, and is back before going to Spain. And I just wanted to thank him also, since it was his idea to create this seminar in which students and faculty work together on innovative research projects. And so we have him to thank for a lot of this. I just wanted to briefly say that the Humanities Institute was founded over 30 years ago on the campus to promote the study and teaching of the humanities at Fairfield University through research initiatives and events, both on campus and in the wider community. And today we're specifically focusing on student research, and I wanted to say that advanced research in the humanities is a long process of working back and forth between complex critical hypotheses, rigorous analysis of texts or artifacts, and the discovery of new material or new interpretive possibilities. This process removes histories, texts, ideas, and works of art from the intellectual inertia that would have them become fossils, and makes them instead into living objects, entities with which we remain in dialogue and negotiation as a way to understand our own moment as well as the past. And I think that's crucial to remember. We're not dealing with a set of sort of ossified ideas, but by engaging critically and constantly and theoretically and in advanced ways with these materials, we're keeping them alive and discovering new ways in which they communicate to us now. They're discovering new ways in which they have things to tell us. And the students who've been doing this work all year really exemplify that nature of humanities research, and I thank them for their work. And I think we should all be encouraged to hear from them today, because I really do think they represent that spirit of humanities research perfectly. And thank you also, of course, to all the faculty mentors who have been guiding them through this work all year, and whom you will hear about soon as Patricia introduces everyone. So with that said, I just want to turn things over to Dean Richard Greenwald, whose ongoing support of the Humanities Institute makes any of this possible, and we're very thankful to have him with us today.
Thank you very much. I am honored to be here to learn from the students. The ability to do research at the level you're doing is important. I'm so proud of the Humanities Institute and the faculty mentors who have been working with you, because the amount of time and effort they've put into this, the amount of passion you've put into this, will really stay with you for quite some time, right? This is important work that you're doing, and it shows that the humanities are alive and well at Fairfield. And I hope that you're talking about the work you're doing to your classmates, to other students, so they could learn about the exciting opportunities that exist in the humanities. I want to thank you for your work. I want to thank your mentors for putting in the time and effort to sort of get you to this level, and I wish you the best. And I'm going to sit back and learn from you. Thanks.
Okay, hi everybody. I have both the most important and the easiest job up here today. The most important because it's my job to introduce these wonderful young scholars and their presentations, and the easiest because the real job for me is to get out of the way, which it occurs to me as sort of a metaphor for being a good professor, is to get out of the way when young scholars have done their such impressive work. Before I do get out of the way, though, I did want to have us all join together and thank the library staff, particularly Matt Bernstein and Jeremiah Mercurio, who've been working with the students all year, as well as with their mentors. They do a great job here at the library. They support the humanities, absolutely, and we're so very lucky to have them. So join me in a round of applause for them. If they cannot hear us, that's because they're having to tag team getting away from the circulation desk, but they're going to be down later on this afternoon. All right, let's go right on into our presentations. We're going to go in alphabetical order, and so I'd first like to introduce Christina Bolt. Christina is a senior, graduating this year with a major in communications and minors in Italian, Spanish, English, and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Those are 4 majors. Minors. Next year, she hopes to be working in social media and/or digital marketing in New York City. And her presentation today is based on her year-long work with Dr. Sarah Diaz. And the title is The Age of Ignorance, Redefining American Manners and Manhood Through Catfights in Wharton's The Age of Innocence. Christina.
So, my presentation, as was mentioned, is The Age of Ignorance, Redefining American Manhood and Manners Through Catfights in Edith Wharton's The Age of Innocence. It's my title. So, if you don't know the novel, I will give you a brief synopsis as what I can with the time I have. So, this novel takes place in the Gilded Age of Old New York and is focused on Newland Archer and the women in his life, the women that we learn about through his gaze. We have May Welland, who represents the true woman. In his eyes, she is the doting, innocent domestic wife. And then on the other hand, we have Ellen Olenska, who represents the new woman, or the other woman. She was born in New York, but she was raised abroad, and now she is back and making things essentially very problematic for everyone in this love triangle that we see, essentially making a catfight. So, when I was first trying to, tackle this project, I was trying to figure out how I was going to approach it. And so I was kind of intrigued by the fact that it had won the Pulitzer Prize in 1921, so I decided to look up the award's description. And I was quite surprised to find out, what it entails. So according to the requirements for the prize, the winning novel is supposed to depict American manners and manhood, which is quite notable. Less than 10 years after this won, they actually dropped that because I guess they realized that women can have stories too. But I thought this was quite interesting because while I agree that this novel fits this description, I ultimately believe that the win suggests a surface-level reading of the novel, that it actually speaks more to this. In reality, Wharton is kind of critiquing the entire idea of the traditional American novel. And I think Wharton would agree with me that her work was misread. Because in her response to a congratulatory letter from her opponent, St. Clair Lewis, she responded by saying, "When I discovered that I was being rewarded for uplifting American morals, I confess I did despair." Me too. So, ultimately, this leads to my thesis and what I'm trying to argue here, that while this appears to be a story of American manners and manhood, it is actually a story of how a man, Newland Archer, loses his manhood by following convention or having manners, and how a woman, Ellen Olenska, gains manhood by going against convention. So, of course, in my research, I was trying to decide how this novel could be read as a traditional American novel. And what I found is quite interesting. This notion of a male protagonist having more than one woman in his life is quite common in American literature. In fact, traditional American novels have frequently adopted the narrative of an American male hero who is shaped by the women in his life on his quest to form his own manhood and define himself. And this is also kind of linked to the notion of the self-made man who would develop true masculinity through self-discipline and self-restraint, such as an abidance to social conventions and having proper manners. However, the self-made man is a paradox because the man is usually shaped by women. More specifically, the American novel tends to reside in contradictions, and these contradictions usually take form in the split representation of women. Usually it takes form of the domestic wife versus the powerful and sexually alluring other woman. And ultimately, we see this with Newland Archer as he navigates his way between May and Ellen. However, while Wharton does follow this American literary tradition, I believe she is seeking to critique the tradition itself And she does this through depicting a catfight between the two women. So the term catfight's actually been around since the 1600s, and it's usually meant to refer to social aggression between women. Social aggression could take forms of such things as gossip, social sabotage, or social stigmatization. And it's usually in an effort to try to ruin the reputation of another woman so she's not necessarily marriage material. And we see this with May and Ellen. May will often make comments to Archer, her husband, about Ellen's deviant nature, how she's so different, how we must bore her. And she often makes reference to the fact that, she's still married, she's not actually available to you. Ellen, on the other hand, often makes references to May's youth and her innocence, trying to make May appear to be childlike. She's boring, she's convention, and trying to draw that contrast. But what I'm trying to argue is this catfight between May and Ellen demonstrates to readers that these women are not just tools for Newland to discover his own manhood, but rather that they are their own people who are beyond the comprehension of a man who believes that he understands them, but he doesn't. Archer believes that Ellen is in need of rescuing because she's a social deviant. Essentially, he thinks that she's a danger to herself. But what we see in her social aggression is that she's rather she's self-reliant, and she doesn't need him. She is heedless to tradition, and she never tries to conform. She actually invites an engaged Newland Archer over to her house late in the evening, which is something a woman would not be seen doing. And this is because she represents the new woman. She is more masculine. She does things that men would typically do. And by doing this, this would be the opportunity in which she would try to stigmatize May and trying to draw that contrast, but you see that she's behaving much more masculine. And then on the side of May, Archer believes that his wife is innocent and ignorant of everything. He believes that she does not know that he has affections for Ellen, but he is wrong. If anything, May is the most savage character in this entire book. And it's quite notable because in an effort to get rid of Ellen, to try to get her out of the picture, she essentially tells Ellen she's pregnant 2 weeks before she even knows for sure. And when she tells this to Newland kind of sits there dumbfounded. And Wharton writes that May's eyes were wet with victory, essentially saying that she won the catfight, she won the prize, although I don't necessarily think that Newland's a great prize because he's kind of an idiot. But I think it proves that it's sort of a catfight. But what's also notable to say is that because Ellen is masculine, she's much more independent. And there comes a point in the novel where she doesn't really want him anymore. She wants something for herself. She wants to be free. She wants to be free from her husband that she, left back in Europe. She wants to be herself and she wants to be independent. And she does attain that. So when we think about Newland Archer, we think about a man who misreads these women, and then we think about the American literary tradition. And if a man is supposed to navigate his way between these contradictory forces of women, and he can't properly do that, how is he supposed to attain self-defined masculinity? Well, he doesn't. Ellen does. And we can make sense of this through Wharton's philosophical influence, Otto Weininger. So, scholar Maria Magdalena Farland discovered that through Wharton's published letters, she wrote tons of letters, she found out that Wharton was actually a huge fan of Weininger's text, Sex and Character, which is actually a very sexist text. He begins it by saying, women are going to have serious issues with what I have to say, but men won't because they're going to like it. They really want to see women be submissive. Which is quite notable that Wharton wanted to, actually follow this and incorporate these ideas into her writing. So from this, we can try to break down Weininger. Very interesting guy. Kind of made my eyes bleed a little bit with what he had to say, but we're here now and it's fine. So Weininger ultimately believed that women were beyond man's understanding, even though he believed that it was man's job to create and form women physically, mentally, and emotionally. And this helps us to explain Wharton's depiction of ignorant Archer, his unreliability of his male gaze. I mean, he creates these women for the reader, but yet he's so wrong about them, and we see that through their catfighting. And Weininger also believed in this notion of pairing, that a man was not complete unless he was with a woman. And at the end of the novel, May had finally, said she was pregnant, and then there's a 26-year gap. And the end of this 26 years, May's dead, so I guess you could say convention killed her. And Ellen, her husband's also dead. And so Newland has every opportunity to go see Ellen, and he doesn't take it. He ends up alone. So ultimately, according to this ideology, he is not a complete man. More so, Weininger's construction of masculinity involved the possession of mental and moral freedom. something that only the masculine type of woman, the new woman, or Ellen Olenska in this case, she would try to attain this male characteristic in order to reach female emancipation. Well, I had said that Ellen wanted to be free, and she wanted to be emancipated, and she was. Throughout this entire novel, she was heedless to tradition. She never tried to conform, and after these 26 years, she's still living life the way that she wants. She never returns to her husband. She lives life independently, and ultimately, she's the most masculine character at the end of this. She has the most manhood. Whereas we see Newland Archer, he's tied to convictions. He's tied to everything conventional, and he does not sway. At the end of the novel, Dallas is his son. This was 26 years later. He essentially says, yeah, Mom told me you were in love with Ellen. She told me on her deathbed. Let's go see her. And they go to France, and then Archer sits there while his son goes up to see Ellen, and he doesn't go. He is self-restrained, and he does not allow himself to be with the unconventional woman. Therefore, he's not mentally and morally free. He's tied to convention. And therefore, we can see that Newland Archer is not a man at the end of this novel because he followed convention. He had manners, whereas Ellen did not have manners, did not follow convention, and yet she gained manhood. So ultimately, that is my presentation.
Thanks, Christina. Our next scholar is Jacqueline Ferrari. Jacqueline worked this year under the mentorship of Dr. Catherine Schwab, and she also is a graduating senior with a double major in chemistry and art history and a minor in studio art. She is currently looking for work after graduation in a cosmetic or pharmaceutical laboratory, for any of those of you who have connections in pharmaceutical laboratories. Her hope is to go on to graduate school in a few years and to seek an advanced degree in chemistry. The title of her research project, which she will share with us today, is Art Ever Finished? A Study of the Subjectivity of Art and the Idea of Completeness. Jacqueline.
Hi, everyone. So as Dr. Barry said, I am studying the idea of whether an artwork can ever be considered complete. I am going to make the claim that no, it can never be considered finished or complete, and I'm going to be doing this through focusing on ancient works of art and understanding how they went from their origins through their reception throughout the centuries, particularly focusing on the Renaissance period, and then going forward into modern day interpretations. I'm focusing also on using ancient and post-ancient writers, and then also new scientific methods and historical understandings to analyze these works of art. So starting with ancient works of art, the ancient Greeks and Romans, their artwork was typically brightly painted, which is a fact many people don't actually know or understand. So the white marbles that we see here in this image of Caligula, or here even in this plaster cast version of the Augustus of Prima Porta, was not how these works were originally meant to be seen. They were usually brightly colored, if not garishly painted, and it kind of brought the work to life. And in many instances, the painter was above the sculptor in terms of artist, and this is then even reflected in the idea that for many ancient Greeks and Romans, they believed that a work of art could not be considered finished unless it was fully painted. And so now going forward, this understanding of how these works of art were understood as being painted is from, first one is Pliny, who's an ancient writer, as well as Suetonius, who's another ancient writer. And a lot of their writings describe what these works of art looked like when they were fully painted. They describe how the paints were made, what chemicals were used to mix to create the different pigments. And they also talk about how the paint was layered onto the actual, the marble or on the building or whatever was painted. And then going forward, you can see through Giorgio Vasari, who some consider one of the first art historians from the Renaissance period. He was around when these works of art were originally being dug up out of the ground after being buried for thousands of years, for about 1,000 years. So he was able to chronicle what was happening during this time, how this was influencing the artist, seeing these white marbles coming out of the ground, since most of the paint had chipped off or was nearly invisible to the naked eye at this point. And so going into then how these works of art were received in the Renaissance period particularly. So you have this first work here that was excavated in the Renaissance period. It's called the Laocoon. And as you could see, this is probably how they saw it when they came out of the ground, probably a little bit dirtier just because, there's a lot of, the dirty dirt on it. But yet there's still that white marble. And the Renaissance artists looked at this and they saw the incredible attributes of the sculpture. They saw how the sculptor paid so much attention to making the body look as realistic as possible, to have that image and the drama that's portrayed just through the marble alone. So going forward, this clearly influenced the Renaissance artists. You have Michelangelo's Pietà, where you see that attention to the bright marble and just having emotion coming through the marble alone without any paintings on it. Then again in the David, and then even going forward into the Baroque period with Bernini, whom we all are familiar with because we have a bust of his up in Bellarmine, with his image of the Rape of Persephone. Where I think you can see a lot of connections between even the Laocoon, which is the twisting images and the hair, the way that it's sculpted, everything. This clearly inspired these artists. And then this idea of depicting sculptures through this image of just a white marble rather than a painted surface resounds through history. I mean, you have it even coming up to today, where we still look at these works of art and don't understand that they were originally very colorfully painted. So understanding how these works were colorfully painted, we do that through those ancient writers, and we also do that through a lot of scientific breakthroughs that have occurred in the past couple of decades. So some scientific techniques which have come around would be the UV visible spectrometer, Raman spectroscopy, and visual-induced luminescence, which all allow you to see potential bits of color which are left on a sculpted image or even on a fresco, which is not visible to the naked eye. And it does this through the paint gives off a certain absorbance, and it reads that absorbance, and you're able to compare it and see what color that is. Now, some of the dangers of actually trusting the scientific understandings of this is that in some cases, the color that you're getting that is coming up is not actually what was put on the surface originally, meaning that it has maybe chemically reacted with another element that was available in the atmosphere or wherever the work of art was being housed, and so the color actually changed. Actually, a fairly recent discovery is from the Villa Mysteries in Pompeii, and as you can see, the very famous Pompeian red color that you have here displayed at the Villa Mysteries, they believe actually was not a red color, was actually more of a yellow color, which when the volcano erupted, it created, the volcanic ash created a chemical reaction with that yellow pigment, and it changed into being this deep red color. Going forward, this is also found in other pigments, such as this red color, which is called cinnabar, different than the red that you see there from the Villa Mysteries. And it is actually, once exposed to UV light, meaning like the sun, it has a chemical reaction and becomes a black color. And so it's interesting to note that the ancient writers such as Pliny, he writes about this in his descriptions of these pigments, and he states how, this color, you can't put it in the sun. Like, let's not put that, like, you can't paint a sculpture that's going to go out in the sun with the cinnabar. You can only have it inside. But of course, even though they still painted with this color, those works of art from 2,000 years ago did not always remain inside in a nice, stable environment. They got put outside, they were buried, they were exposed to all different elements and possible forms of destruction. So now going forward into modern day interpretations of ancient art, you may ask, why is it important to try to understand what were these colors were? How does this help me in describing to you why I believe a work is not considered finished? And I would say that looking at all the different proposals that you have of what these works of art may have originally looked like, add to the discussion and the understanding of these works, and it adds to the life of it in a way. So you have the Augustus of Prima Porta, who we also have his head right over here. And you have many different renditions of what they believe the work looked like. And the reason why there's a lot of just discussion of how the colors might have appeared on him is because you don't know how exactly the paint was laid. Was it layered, or was it just one single color, which I doubt. But still, all that is up for discussion. And also looking at the ancient writers, Suetonius states that Augustus had blonde hair, gray eyes, a unibrow, and crooked teeth. Not the most handsome guy. But you can see in the statue they were not actually true to that rendition. You don't see a unibrow on him, and you certainly don't see the crooked teeth. But so it's hard to know if what they are saying about these works of art, if how they were painted was actually true to life and what we understand of them. So finally, to make my point of why can a work of art ever be considered finished, I would say that no, because the object biography, just understanding how a work grows and changes, even though there might only be a head left or a foot left, that piece of that sculpture still has a sublime beauty to it. It is still a work of art in and of itself that is slowly changing. Missing a nose or missing the rest of its body, it's still kind of growing and changing with each new addition to it, or in this case, removal of it. And I would like to make the case that just as a human is created, there is no finished on date for a human, just as then a work of art could be considered just like that. That each new experience that comes and affects it, how it's received in the world, everything changes, and it continues to grow and change just as we do. So, oh, wait, this is the cool part.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Our next presenter is Camille Jacobus. She's a senior, graduating in May, with a major in international studies and minors in anthropology and humanitarian action. Her Humanities Institute mentor this year has been Dr. Gwen Alfonso. Next year, she'll be attending New York University and pursuing a master's degree in hospitality industry studies. She reports that she is passionate about blending her humanitarian concerns with the hospitality field and working with refugees, especially beyond graduation. Her presentation for us today is Social Media Revolution, a way to explain public apathy and governmental inaction during humanitarian crises. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So thank you for being here. This is so exciting, and I'm very excited to share my research. This is my title on social media revolution because in the Humanities Institute, I am an interdisciplinary major as international studies, so I'm really combining media theory with history and my personal passion of refugees. So my research question up here is why it is that despite the plethora of media today, there is still public apathy and governmental inaction during humanitarian crises. We have the social media revolution that's been happening, since the early 2000s, and yet we still live in an age that while we are millennials, we are not connected. We might be connected over online, but not when it comes to these problems that are taking place, unless you are at a Jesuit university like Fairfield, thankfully. So in trying to understand this question, I'm doing a historical case study on the Rwanda genocide of 1994 to the Rohingya refugee crisis that's taking place today, and is continuing in 2018, which many of you might not or might do know about. In understanding this, I basically compare the fact that there was limited media back in 1994, and I'll go into that. But at that time, that was really the excuse, if you want to say, for public apathy and governmental inaction. Today, there's an abundance of media. I mean, there's just in this one room so many different technologies. So we can't say that we don't know what's happening, yet there remains public apathy and governmental inaction. So why is this? So in trying to understand this, I first looked at the Rwanda genocide of 1994. I can't go into the whole history in this time period, but those 3 points are the main things you need to know. 800,000 Tutsis were murdered within 100 days. That accounts for about 333.5 deaths per hour, 5.5 deaths per minute. So in this 7-minute presentation, you can just imagine. Genocide was a label that was not used by the UN, but it was used by the press. And just kidding, other way around. Genocide was not used by the UN, no, by the press. Right, but by the UN. And so this was an issue. And a part of that was because there were limited reporters on the ground there, except for Romeo Dallaire. He was the peacekeeping general at the time. And he sent a fax that said there was a genocide. But genocide is a very legally weighted word, and that would require world powers as well as the United Nations to actually take action, which is something that they did not want to do at the time. So I argue that even when there were reports on the genocide, they caused three different things: dehumanization, compassion fatigue, and mediated experiences. Dehumanization is essentially when you take away the positive qualities of human. So for the Rwanda genocide, a lot of the reports that were coming out were saying it was, barbaric savagery, and it was playing into this racial bias towards Africa as this continent of people who are inhumane and crazy people. There was also compassion fatigue because at the same time period, there was also the sub-Saharan African famines, which killed millions. And not only were reporters tired of hearing about Africa, but people in general, they didn't want to hear about Africa anymore. I mean, there's so many times you can see a child with flies in their eyes and all these things. So it creates this compassion fatigue. And then there's also mediated experiences, because no matter what news you're getting from what source, you're never actually there. You're never the prime source of what's happening. So it really distances people from understanding what's taking place. So today, we have the Rohingya refugee crisis. And essentially, those three things are still happening today, just in a more fascinating way, because screens are in front of our faces all day long. So we have the Rohingya refugee crisis. In this capacity, 354 villages are being burnt and 671,000 and counting refugees have fled. The Rohingya crisis is taking place because in the Rakhine state in Myanmar, it is majoritively Buddhist, and the Rohingya are the minority Muslim. But since 1982, they have been fleeing essentially because there was a Citizenship Act that made the Rohingya illegal immigrants in the country. So essentially, this is not new to the United Nations or the world, but what is new is the extensive burning of villages that are taking place. And the problem with this is that now the popular press is saying this is a genocide, but the UN is not saying that this is a genocide. And this is creating a new type of compassion fatigue, because now genocide is just thrown around like this everyday term, and it does not connote the exact extremity of what is taking place, from the rapes and the violence and the burn victims. And a problem with this is also that, machetes were used in the Rwanda genocide, so bodies would be piled up, and that was evidence. Burned villages, it's very hard to sift through that and really understand what's going on, but we know what is taking place. So I argue that it's really that there's been a decline also in the traditional news consumption, increase in social media. And this is a problem because the quality and the quantity of news in general today, especially social media, is very, very bad. So these are just some of the quotes and the headlines of popular news today, saying, these are the mass graves, this is genocide, and even recognizing that the UN is they're convinced, but they might not really know. From CNN to the Associated Press to The Guardian, people are saying this is a genocide. On the other side of things, you also have people saying fake news. So with fake news, they're saying, on Facebook that the Rohingya, they're making up these stories because the Rohingya, there's no dehumanization. People do have technology, and they're making it seem that these Rohingya refugees are making up these stories and that they're fleeing, but that really they've started these atrocities. So people on one hand want to believe the UN, but then they want to believe the Rohingya, and then they want to believe Myanmar. So it's a conundrum. And then you get to social media. So on the New York Times, you have 3.2 million followers, and they show these harrowing photos of these Rohingya refugees. They're fleeing persecution and violence. And within the caption, though, this is just part of their 2017 recap of the world, essentially, where there's been hurricanes and floods and all of these things. So it downplays the fact that villages are being burnt and thousands of people are being killed as I give this presentation right now. But then from there, you have this picture. And this is from UNHCR, and they're the UNHCR, the refugee agency. So this photo is showing, smiling, happy, clean, working Rohingya refugees now that they're in the refugee camp. And it's, saying that they're working very hard to make sure that these refugees are happy. But that is not explaining that in Bangladesh, they are trying to close essentially a lot of the camps and get rid of the Rohingya refugees. And this is showing stability, which is a complete contrast to urgency of these humanitarian disasters. Another part, even in social media, they are saying that this is a rapid mass exodus in modern history, one of the most harrowing ones that we've seen, and they're showing these images. But then when it says, go look at UNHCR for more information, you see these girls. And it's not to say that there aren't positive things happening in these refugee camps, but showing that there's education up to 5th grade is showing, again, stability, but nothing is stable there because monsoon season is happening, and that's threatening to debase the entire refugee camp. And then once again, working, and this is from the news sources, and then you get to the UN, and then it's these captivating photos. And the problem with this is that as this is taking place, traditional news consumption is decreasing. The internet, social media is completely taking over. As that's happening, the social media just in general keeps increasing. I'll go through this quickly so I don't have time. But that keeps increasing. And social media as a news platform in and of itself is what's captivating people. So we have, from the Arab Springs uprising to the Me Too movements. I mean, people have protests with the signs, with hashtags. So, that's such a new concept. And this is such a problem because there's so much distrust in the news and in social media. So as all of this other sources are increasing, so is the distrust. And this keeps fueling this fake news capacity. And in my argument, essentially, it's that we are drowning in technology and information, and yet we are still living through the same history that's happened through the Rwanda genocide, where nobody wanted to say that we really knew what was going on and wanted to admit to the atrocities. But we have the news now, we have the hard facts, and it's just, it makes us question, when is it that we are going to learn and that history is going to stop being this cyclical realm of just repeat and repeat. That's it.
Great, thanks, Camille. Our next student scholar is Isabella Guzzo. She is a senior graduating this year with a major in psychology and minors in health studies and Italian. She also worked with Dr. Diaz this year as her mentor, and after graduation, she plans to work as a research assistant and continue her graduate study of clinical psychology. She presents for us today her research, Morgante, a case study in disability studies during Renaissance Italy. Isabella.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. Once again, the title of my work is, excuse me, Morgante, a case study in disability studies during Renaissance Italy. And just like a quick little background information as to why I decided to complete my research on this. So as a psychology major, I've always been interested in social psychology, specifically stereotyping and labeling. But during my time at Fairfield, I also developed a strong passion for Italian, and after studying abroad in Florence, Italy, I developed a new love for the Renaissance. So I figured that this was a great way for me to combine both of my passions. All right, so I just wanted to give a quick little background on what disability was like during the Renaissance. Specifically, my research is focusing on 15th and 16th century Italy, and I looked at the Medici court. During this time, there was a larger emphasis on the arts and the sciences. So unfortunately, there wasn't really a fine line between the mentally disabled and the physically disabled. Pretty much if you acted differently, looked differently, you were considered an other. The physically disabled especially were technically seen as others because obviously their appearance was different, so it was much easier to notice that they were physically different. So how were the disabled viewed during this time? As a psychology major, I like to have an answer to back everything up. So this helped me find that there were various models of how disability was viewed, and models of disability help individuals make sense of the disabled. It also affects how the disabled are viewed and treated. So specifically during this time, the two models of disability that were used were the biomedical model and also the religious model. The religious model focuses on how bodily differences were understood through biblical references. So unfortunately, it was believed that if parents had a child that was disabled, they probably committed a sin or some type of crime, and their punishment was having a disabled child. The biomedical model, on the other hand, reflected the medical and scientific knowledge that was expanding during this time. So secular humanism increased the amount of knowledge about the human body, and as a result, there was also a greater emphasis on treatment, and various scientists started to try to find cures for the physically disabled specifically, such as the blind and the deaf. There was also, as a result of the biomedical model, there was a greater understanding for the physically disabled, since scientists and doctors wanted to try to find a cure for their physical issues. So there are various types of physical disabilities that I could have chosen to look at. However, I chose to specifically look at dwarfism. This is because the Medici family in particular was known to have multiple dwarves in their palace, and these dwarves were owned, indulged, traded, exploited, and even sent as gifts. However, during this time, it was extremely popular for court jesters in the Renaissance to be dwarves. And they were so popular that most of the times a lot of parents tried to artificially stunt their children. So they would anoint baby spines with the grease of bats, moles, and other different rodents, just in hopes that their child will be born a dwarf. So that way they could potentially end up in the court. Court dwarfs had a high status in society, and it was a luxury to have a child that was a dwarf in the court. And if they were really good at what they did, they gained a high reputation. So as a result, I decided to look at Morgante, and Morgante is a little bit different. So unfortunately, during this time, a lot of the times, yes, it was an honor to be a court dwarf. Yes, you had high luxury compared to other individuals with physical disabilities, but you pretty much were still looked at as a pet. You were owned by the court. You did what they wanted you to do. If you weren't really meeting their expectations for entertainment, they probably would have found a new one. You were owned by them. Morgante, on the other hand, he kind of had a little bit of a different relationship. So he ended up working in the service of Cosimo I de' Medici. He was most likely born around 1530 and worked for Cosimo for almost his entire life. Ironically, his name is Morgante because he was named after the giant in Luigi Pulci's 1478 Morgante Maggiore. This was extremely common back then, and other dwarves also carried the name Morgante because it highlighted the comical aspect in such a pun. Morgante and Cosimo developed their relationship because Cosimo really enjoyed watching the dwarves in his court put on shows in the sense of fighting with different animals or fighting with each other. So in one situation, Morgante fought with a monkey and almost killed the monkey, so Cosimo had to step in before the monkey would die. And as a result, Cosimo was so amused by Morgante that they kind of started getting a little bit closer, and Morgante got to know Cosimo's family. Supposedly, he even was really close to his daughter, Isabella. And as this relationship developed, Cosimo obviously treated him much better than other dwarf court jesters. He even got to the point where he granted him a life full of rights. So not only was he giving him lavish goods such as clothes and gifts, but he got to the point where he allowed Morgante to have property, get married, have children, and even appear before a court to defend his rights. Morgante was even paid by Cosimo, so Morgante's ability to handle a sum of money and be paid showed how he was granted legal rights of a full citizen. So obviously, Morgante's presence meant a lot more to Cosimo than other court dwarves. So in order for me to understand Morgante's importance, I was able to obviously find multiple biographies and letters, but the most important thing that helped me understand how important Morgante was to Cosimo was different types of artwork. And this artwork right here is by Giorgio Vasari. It's called Cosimo I de' Medici as a Superintendent in Elba. So in this artwork, it is believed that Morgante went with Cosimo in his visit to Elba. So during this time, pirates of North Africa were destroying the island of Elba, and the people hoped that Cosimo would be able to create a defensive structure that would protect the island. So if you look at this artwork in the corner, I highlighted it, you can see the right profile and the right shoulder of Morgante. This painting, the location of it is on the first floor of the Palazzo Vecchio in a room that if you walk in, it's right on the right in the center. So the positioning of the roundel is also extremely important. You can also tell, based on just the way that the painting was created, that Cosimo might be making eye contact with Morgante because his eyes are looking down. So based on where the location of the roundel was, as well as how the painting was painted, because Cosimo obviously had authority over how he wanted the painting to be portrayed, so the fact that he insisted that Morgante would be in it just goes to show how important Morgante was to him. So this one's my favorite. And this is by Agnolo Bronzino, and this is called Portrait of a Dwarf Morgante. This is probably the most famously known representation of Morgante, and I actually came across this painting, and this was a huge reason why I ended up choosing him. But this painting was created for Cosimo. He asked Bronzino to paint a full-length front-back portrait of Morgante, and as you can tell, his body is not ideal, and it is depicted as being far from a perfect Renaissance body. But the way that Bronzino painted Morgante also explains how Morgante was viewed. So for instance, as you can see, there's southern swallowtail butterflies, which depict Morgante as an object. The butterflies were collectibles during this time, so it kind of goes to show that Morgante is also a part of a status of popular collectibles, just as these butterflies. It leads to the desirability of owning a dwarf such as Morgante. He's also nude, and his nudity perceives him to be as an other, and this could either be seen as violating or informing. Violating in the sense that Morgante's nudity invades his privacy and as a way to express his lower status. So even though he is seen with Cosimo most of the time, he is still a dwarf in society, and that means he's obviously of lower status. However, it can also be informing because Morgante is painted in a manner that brings awareness to dwarves. The nudity may bring a more normal human feel since artists tended to depict numerous individuals nude. There's also other various aspects to the painting that I analyzed. However, the most important part of this painting that made me realize that Morgante meant more to Cosimo than an average other dwarf in his court was where the painting is located. During Cosimo's rule, the painting was placed in the Palazzo della Signoria, in a room where Cosimo would have any of his guests or foreigners that would visit him stay. So these individuals would walk in, and the first thing they would see would be Morgante's portrait front and back. There was barely any other artwork in this area besides just maps and globes. So the fact that Morgante was given a legible identity that linked him to the court and the court to himself showed how important he was to Cosimo. If Morgante had not been recognizable as an individual belonging to and partly defining the Medici court, Cosimo would have hesitated placing the painting in a room where he knew any visitors would obviously ask him, who is this individual? So overall, Morgante's role in the Medici court shifted away from the stereotypical way dwarves were viewed. The relationship that he developed with Cosimo was unlike any other relationship that other court dwarves had with people in the court. So it allowed him to have pretty much equal rights as a citizen with someone without disabilities.
Thank you, Isabella. Pamela Kask, who worked with mentor Gwen Alfonso, is a senior, graduating this year with a double major in philosophy and English, and minors in mathematics, peace and justice studies, women and gender studies, and classical studies. And later tonight, she'll receive a variety of awards, as I know many of our students will, from Fairfield for her work in these many fields. Next year, she will be attending Oxford University in England, where she will pursue a master's degree in medieval studies. The title of her presentation is "Her Mind is Fierce, She's a Terror. Images of Motherhood in Plato's Republic, and Euripides' Medea.
So as Dr. Berry said, the title of my presentation is Her Mind is Fierce, She's a Terror, Images of Motherhood in Plato's Republic and Euripides' Medea. So I wanted to work on this project because, as was said, I'm a double major in philosophy and English literature. So this project was a way for me to bring both of those interests together into one combined effort. So I worked with two primary texts in this project, and the first of them is Plato's Republic. So it was written around 380 BC, and the exact date is unknown. It's just a tentative estimation. And Plato's Republic is composed of 10 books and is written in the form of a Socratic dialogue. So this means that Plato wrote it as a conversation between Socrates and his companions. And the topic of their discussion throughout the book is justice. So what makes a man just, what makes a man unjust, and which life is better to lead, the life of the unjust man or the life of the just man? So Socrates and his companions realized that discovering the definition of justice is much more difficult than they had first imagined. So they decided to use an example to aid in their conversation. And they begin to construct an ideal just city in their minds. And they believe that if they can just understand how justice functions within a city as a whole, they can eventually move on to understanding how justice works in general, and specifically within an individual. So where does motherhood fit in Plato's Republic? Well, in this ideal just city that they formulate, marriages are structured by the rulers of the city. So the people who are in charge decide who gets to marry who in order to produce the best children. Men and women are to have equal education and an equal opportunity to pursue the same vocations. So if a woman wished to be a warrior or a guardian, as Socrates calls them, to protect the city, then she is encouraged to do so. To justify his call for equal education, Socrates says, "Do we believe the females of the guardian dogs must guard the things the male guards along with them, and hunt with them, and do the rest in common? Or must they stay indoors as though they were incapacitated as a result of bearing and rearing the puppies?" So in this quote, Socrates is somewhat implying, or saying almost explicitly, that he thinks of motherhood as something that handicaps women, that might incapacitate them, and prevent them from being able to participate equally with men in society. So in order to remedy this situation of this incapacitation of women, he says that the family unit, motherhood in particular, must become a public institution and not a private relationship between a mother and a child. So mothers in Plato's ideal city are encouraged to not know their own children, but to bring them once they are born to common nurseries, where all mothers care for all children equally. So for Socrates in the Republic, men and women will be able to be equal citizens if and only if the duties of motherhood are alleviated from women. So my second source was Euripides' Medea. So it's a Greek tragedy, and it was first performed in 431 BCE. Medea, the main character of the play, is abandoned by her husband Jason when he leaves to marry the princess of Corinth. So that is the city in which Medea and Jason are exiles. So Jason says that he leaves her to marry this princess in order to protect his family in this foreign land. But Medea does not believe his excuse, is very angry, and resolves to get revenge on Jason and his new bride. So Medea and Jason have two sons, and they are now endangered by their father's new marriage because they are his actual legitimate heirs. Medea is also seen as a threat to the new relationship. And the king of Corinth threatens to have them exiled. So Medea is actually offered asylum in Athens. However, the help is only for herself. She cannot bring her two children with her. So she makes the decision to kill her children and escape to Athens, preserving her own honor instead of her duties as a mother. And she is quoted as saying, "You see, my friends, I will not let my enemies laugh at me." So she chooses to get revenge and harm her enemies rather than save the lives of her children. So clearly motherhood is a very pivotal point in the play Medea. So in the play, Medea actually calls the role of women pathetic. And by pathetic, she means that a woman is defined by her husband, while a man is only defined by himself. One of her most famous lines from the play reads, "I'd rather take my stand behind a shield 3 times than go through childbirth once," as that pretty much incapacitated her entire idea of what motherhood is to her. So she has the nature of a warrior, not really of a mother. And she is very clearly frustrated with society's limitations on how she can exist as a woman in their city. So my argument is built on the following two premises. First, that in the Republic, Plato outlines this ideal just city and the way motherhood looks in this city. And then within the play Medea, Euripides defines this deviant mother whose warrior nature would garner her the most acceptance within Plato's ideal city, because Medea would prefer to be a warrior instead of a mother. And she would prefer to have her duties as motherhood alleviated by this public relationship. And from there, my thesis is that viewing Plato's The Republic and Euripides' Medea side by side offers a joint window through which not only to view both writers' ideals of the roles in which mothers could or could not exist, but also to observe how these ideals can contribute to our contemporary debate concerning the roles of mothers and motherhood in our society today. And this is where I talk about why this is important to us now, because of course I love reading Plato, I love reading Euripides, but not everybody does. So how is this important to a grander scheme of things? In her book, The Neutered Mother, the Sexual Family, and Other 20th Century Tragedies, Martha Albertson Feynman writes, "I consider motherhood to be a unique but a legally invisible social experience. The potential for the experience of motherhood is what has historically differentiated female from male public existence in our society. Motherhood has been the basis for discrimination and devaluation." Many of the same notions about mothers and motherhood that existed during the time of Plato and Euripides still do exist today. So for example, we still view motherhood as being somewhat of a burden or an inhibitor to the female existence in society. There are people who believe that you can't be both a mother and have a successful career, and women who wish to have careers and have children are often encouraged to utilize daycare facilities, nannies, or babysitters in a style that's not totally unlike Plato's strategy in the Republic of having children being cared for in a public area. There are also the stigmatized of having children young. So children in and of itself are seen as burdensome. So young couples are often encouraged to wait a little bit before they have children if for some reason children are going to inhibit their lives in some way or be like a negative aspect. So overall, in conclusion, these kinds of issues were as real to Plato and Euripides over 2,000 years ago as they are to us now. So I believe that studying what they said about them then can perhaps help us with our own contemporary conversations surrounding mothers and motherhood today. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. Bella Lopez Silva is a junior majoring in history and Spanish. She worked this year under the mentorship of Dr. Jennifer Adair. She has minor fields of study in Latin American and Caribbean studies and in education. Her plan for next year is to come back to us and finish her undergraduate career. Her project, which she will present for us today, is a historical perspective of undocumented youth.
Okay, so I will be presenting a historical perspective of undocumented youth. And so the reason why I chose to write about this is because the issue of immigration is currently at the forefront of political debates. Congress and representatives frequently find themselves trying to negotiate some kind of reform, but despite the deadlines and pressure from different immigrant groups, they fail to do so. So I'm going to be taking you guys through a look back at other experiences from different immigrant groups and how they've been advocating in this continuous fight for immigration rights. So we'll start with the Bracero program, which is a program that started during World War II. It was 1942, and men were fighting the war, and so there was a shortage of labor in the U.S., and a solution to this was to bring guest workers from Mexico. So in 1942, the United States and Mexico signed the Mexican Farm Labor Agreement and helped to create the Bracero program by executive order in 1942. So the Bracero program, the word bracero comes from the Spanish word brazo, meaning arm, and refers to the manual labor performed by these workers. And from 1942 to 1954, over 4.5 million contracts were signed, and it could be one of the largest U.S. contract labor in the U.S. history. So in the image on the left, that's braceros performing their work in the fields, and the image on the right is a more contemporary portrayal of this. So from these two images, we see that in the past 50 to 60 years, not a lot has changed for some populations in their status as immigrants in the U.S. So Operation Wetback, once the Bracero program was terminated, many employers encouraged their guest workers to remain in the country on expired visas, and many men ended up staying so that they could receive better pay. It wasn't the best pay, but it was better than what they could have earned in Mexico. So in 1954, Immigration and Naturalization Services, or the INS, launched Operation Wetback, which gave Border Patrol the permission to use military-like principles and tactics in order to detain and deport masses of people. In conjunction with the Mexican government, sadly, they supported this, about 1.3 million people were deported. And once again, on the image on the right, we see a contemporary view of this, and on the image on the left, we see Mexican workers awaiting to board a train in 54, and then this is more recent. So the rallies of 2006, now we're going to be in the 21st century, unauthorized immigration and immigrant labor are still at the core of immigration disputes. As a result of this, immigrants began to more openly advocate for their rights. In 2006, there were massive rallies across the country advocating in support of immigration reform and against harsh sanctions and law proposals against immigrants. So these rallies occurred in the major U.S. cities. So we have the image on the left over there, on the right, that's in Queens, New York, and then this other image is from Los Angeles. On January 1st of 2010, 4 Dreamers began their march to Washington, D.C. from Miami to Florida. They walked all the way there. It was 1,500 miles, and their mission was to meet with then President Barack Obama in order to get his support for a DREAM Act. The 4 Dreamers who participated in the walk were Gaby Pacheco, Felipe Matos, Carlos Roa, and Juan Rodriguez. Unfortunately, they were not able to meet with the president, but they did gain acknowledgement from other undocumented youth groups and the media. In 2010, a Dreamer Manifesto was published in Dissent magazine, and this marked the Dreamers' official entrance into the political debates. One of the key figures are the Dreamer, the students, and who are now most of them protected by DACA, which was passed in 2012 by President Barack Obama. The DREAM Act was first proposed in 2001 and would provide undocumented youth the right to remain in this country and also provides a path towards citizenship. DACA, which stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, was granted in 2012 as an executive order from Barack Obama. As of today, the country has not experienced the changes that Dreamers wish to see and the changes that they have advocated for. DACA is only grants a temporary solution to this debate, and under the current presidential administration, DACA has been resigned but continues under very strict restrictions. And the future of the DACA beneficiaries, who are fellow classmates, co-workers, teachers, doctors, lawyers, is unknown. So one of my major findings in my paper was the similarities that exist between these groups. For example, like you saw in the images, the braceros and current immigrant groups, they do a lot of the same work. They're still doing the same jobs that they've done historically. And it just shows how this unchanging history just continues. It's like a continuing cycle. Braceros and more recent immigrants, including undocumented youth, their lives continue to be in the short term. The Bracero program provided workers with a temporary visa to enter the U.S. for a couple of months at a time. And now DACA was only another temporary solution, which lasted 2 years. So with the current administration, people have lost their DACA status and live in fear of deportation. These parallels are a sign that change needs to occur if we want to continue to be a country of immigrants.
Thank you, Bella. Our next presenter is Erin Monahan, who worked under the supervision of Dr. Cecilia Bucky this year. Erin is a senior, graduating with a major in history and minors in sociology, American studies, and Black studies. Next year, she will be working with AmeriCorps somewhere in the DC area. Erin.
Let me pull it up. So, I plan to participate in the AmeriCorps program upon my graduation, so I'm really interested in welfare policy and how that impacts. In this case, the Great Depression. I took the seminar with Dr. Bucky last semester, and I got really interested in the Connecticut State Senator Frederick C. Walcott. He was the senator for Connecticut from 1929 to 1935. And in order to understand his response to the Great Depression, we first have to go over the historiography of welfare. All right. So first we are going to start in the Progressive Era. So the Progressive Era of welfare reform mainly has three strains. So we have the patrician elite strain of welfare reform, and this is centered around upper and middle class people, and they advocate for anti-vice campaigns, and mainly they blame the social ills of society on the excesses of the social order. So in anti-vice campaigns, one of those was, of course, prohibition. So the excess of alcohol creates social ill. And another strain of progressive reform was the populist movement among agrarian farmers. They blamed the ills of society on banks and political corruption. And the last strain of reform that is especially salient today is urban and working class reform. They saw that the social ills of society were caused by the capitalist system. And the complicity of those that participated in the system including business leaders. And supporters of this strain of welfare, they wanted labor unions. And notable participants in this strain include the Socialist Labor Party and the Knights of Labor. And they wanted the establishment of higher wages, shorter hours, and better working and living conditions. So next, in order to understand welfare policy, we have to go over the idea of deserving and undeserving poor. So sadly, we have developed this idea of who is deserving of poor relief and welfare. It's been established that poverty is conflated with this idea of pauperism. So pauperism is basically the belief that poverty is solely looked to as the product of him or her who is engaged in it. And they've become dishonored, uncared for. They're vagabonds, incorrigible beasts. Nothing really nice to say about the undeserving poor. And the most undeserving are young, able-bodied men, especially the racial issue, young, able-bodied black men. But the deserving poor, on the other hand, those are women, children, and soldiers. All right. And with deserving poor being women, children, and soldiers, certain social policies are developed to advocate for them, and this creates what is called the maternalist state. So the maternalist state includes policies like the Children's Bureau. So the Children's Bureau was in part established by President Franklin Roosevelt in 1909 with the White House Conference on the Care of Dependent Children. So Roosevelt declared that the interests of the nation should be in children. He said children should not be deprived of home life except for urgent and compelling reasons. Included in this conference was that Roosevelt advocated for women to be part of the national policy of welfare because the widowed or deserted mother, this is a quote, if a good woman willing to work and to do her best should ordinarily be helped in such a fashion that will enable her to bring her children herself in their natural home. So, yeah. While the national interest was on relief to women, children, soldiers including soldier pensions from the Spanish-American Civil War and World War I, otherwise called the Great War, welfare relief was largely, actually only, in the private sphere. And you get that with the charity organization societies. So charity organization societies were funded privately and gave out private relief to those deserving poor. And there's also two types of relief that they gave out, indoor relief versus outdoor relief. So indoor relief is a much more punitive practice that would put you in a poorhouse or an almshouse. And outdoor relief is basically like the liberal giving out cash and allowing them to live in their home. All right. So going farther away from the progressive era, we have international and national welfare policy in the Great War and its aftermath. So unfortunately, in the lead up to the Great War, welfare policy is not really an issue. We don't really talk about it. There's no significant policy development during this time. And instead, efforts are turned to abroad welfare. So one effort was the Commission for Relief in Belgium, and this was orchestrated by Herbert Hoover, and this is a private example of international welfare relief. And basically, the Commission for Relief in Belgium was established because of the issue of famine and the unavailability of food, specifically in Belgium, and then it was expanded in the U.S. Food Administration that was created by Wilson and, of course, headed by Hoover to address the issue of famine in Western Europe countries in general during the Great War. Lastly, we had the American Relief Administration, which was created after the Great War to address, of course, the issue of famine, again, in war-torn countries such as Hungary and Poland. So Hoover comes from this tradition of private welfare relief, and I found that Senator Walcott, he is of similar belief to Hoover. He's actually best friends with Hoover because he is part of the Rockefeller, Rockefeller's initiative for food relief. Rockefeller works with the Commission for Relief in Belgium. And Hoover and Walcott meet at this time, and they become lifelong friends. Walcott, he has a fishing cabin up in Connecticut. He would invite Hoover over on the weekends to fish. But basically, Hoover's policies to address the Great Depression go along the line of private welfare. So he has the issue of associationalism, where he really is just the cheerleader of private business and administering relief. He calls for share the work, where while it's supposed to make workers get work hours, but really just cuts it down and cuts it down and cuts it down just so everybody can work, and they're just not making enough to live. He also has ad campaigns like Meatless Mondays, which he did during the Great War. So, public relation campaigns, not really anything public policy. And he had the belief that prosperity was just around the corner. He thought that the market would provide, which is the prevailing Republican notion in government at this time. And Walcott really aligns with Hoover on this issue, unfortunately. And what I found to be the problem of Republican progressivism was that while they have, like the progressive area had like the Children's Bureau and the Shepherd-Towner Act, unfortunately, the federal government does not get involved with the administration of welfare and poor relief, which was dreadfully needed during the Great Depression. Walcott, he really is a Hooverite on this issue. He votes on the party line. While he has shown support for mothers and children and soldiers, he does not support the first 100 days of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Notably, he did not agree with the 1933 Securities Act. He thought that it would put business in a straitjacket, and the financing of new industry would be impossible. And then the stock market bill would impose strict regulations on the stock market, which he thought to be social ill. He thought it would hurt America. And really, like, he's a Republican progressive only when it comes to women and children, but he aligns with Hoover on the giving out of relief. And he was born in February 19th, 1869, to a wealthy Yankee family. He traces back his lineage to Salem, Massachusetts, I believe. And this really informs also his policy. He's wealthy. He hasn't had to worry about getting welfare. And his tenure as a senator reflects his elite progressive views. He is of the patrician strain of progressivism that I described earlier. He mainly, while he blames the social ills of society on the excesses of the order, he does not advocate for government intervention. And I believe that welfare is salient to today because of the 1996 welfare reform. We have connections into that because it brings us back to immediately prior to the Great Depression, where there's almost no social programs to address government responsibility in giving out welfare. The welfare reform of 1996 severely curtailed the cash assistance programs for welfare, and also put in a work requirement for welfare. In order to receive welfare, you basically have to work, and if you don't work, you can't receive welfare. And then there's the 2-year requirement. If you have welfare for 2 years, you get kicked off. And that just state is retreating from giving out welfare, and it is retreating from the policies of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the first and second New Deals. Unfortunately, Walcott, he is a problematic progressive because of his lack of support in government intervention and welfare policies. And that is it.
Thank you, Erin. Our last presenter is John Simon. JP is a senior English major with concentration in literature and cultural studies and minors in philosophy and Black studies. This year, he worked with Humanities Institute mentor, Dr. Johanna Garvey. Next year, he will be attending law school at the University of Notre Dame. His presentation for us today is titled, "With Too Much Tea in Him, Anti-Colonialism and Nationalism in the Career of Kakuzo Okakura." John.
Okay. Hey there. So obviously, thank you all for being here. I'd just like to take a minute to really thank my mentor, Dr. Garvey. She was actually my first English professor at Fairfield University, so it's been a good full circle thing to work with her. She's also, if anyone in here is an undergraduate with more time, Bella, take a class with her. That's the best piece of advice I can give anybody. So I'm going to try to do something a little different with my presentation. Instead of giving you sort of a general overview, I'm going to focus on one specific element, and I'm going to use the PowerPoint to anchor myself in the text while I just sort of spin off over here. We'll see how that goes. So we're going to talk about Kakuzo Okakura as a colonized intellectual. So I'm borrowing that phrase from Frantz Fanon, and specifically his essay on national culture, which he publishes in The Wretched of the Earth in 1963. Originally, he delivers it as a speech in 1959 at the Second Congress of Black Writers and Artists in Rome. And what he does in this essay is he traces the evolution of the colonized intellectual. So the intellectual born into a system of colonization who is motivated to resist it. He's talking about Africa in the 1960s. Kakuzo Okakura is Japanese in the early 1900s, like 00s. So very different context, but I think there's some really, really striking similarities that I'm hoping to bring out. So just to sort of give you a heads up, so Fanon holds anti-colonialism as indebted to nationalism, that nationalism is the font from which anti-colonial critique can grow. The nation becomes the unit of resistance that can activate a colonized people to political engagement. So to go to the first quote, he writes, "I concede the fact that the actual existence of an Aztec civilization has done little to change the diet of today's Mexican peasant. This passionate quest for a national culture prior to the colonial era can be justified by the colonized intellectuals' shared interest in stepping back and taking a hard look at the Western culture in which they risk becoming ensnared." What is the use of a colonized intellectual finding, if they are a Mexican colonized intellectual, finding the glory and the grandeur of a long-gone Aztec empire? It is not, as Fanon says, necessarily a practical advantage that they can provide to the contemporary Mexican people. Instead, what it is it's for the colonized intellectual, him or herself. The process of becoming an intellectual in a colonized society is a process of indoctrination into colonial methods of thought, colonial learning. And so what this history of some anti-colonial or non-colonial greatness does is sort of liberate the mind. Now, Okakura never talks about his risk of becoming ensnared or that of any other Japanese. That has to do more with how he understands nationalism. The idea that there can be Japanese people acting from anything other than a Japanese standpoint, right, nationally or colonially speaking, that's not a concept that he has acquired yet, that has entered into the discussion yet. But Okakura scholars have just jumped all over that because in his upbringing, you can see the places where he gets indoctrinated or where he's taught English before he's taught to write Japanese, where he's likes to sit in Tokyo cafes as a college student and talk about Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, right? And that he is a product of Meiji Japan as well, which is just undergoes a tremendous process of westernization during his lifetime. And so to carry on, Fanon writes that colonialism's condemnation is continental in scale. Colonialism's claim that the pre-colonial period was akin to a darkness of the human soul refers to the entire continent of Africa. The colonized endeavors to rehabilitate himself and escape the sting of colonialism obey the same rules of logic. For Fanon, the first move of the colonized intellectual is Pan-Africanism, is making common cause with the entirety of the peoples oppressed by colonialism. And so for Okakura, this is from his first book, The Ideals of the East in 1903, he writes, "Asia is one, the Himalayas divide only to accentuate two mighty civilizations, but not even the snowy barriers can interrupt for one moment that broad expanse of love for the ultimate and universal, which is the common thought inheritance of every Asiatic race." This profound statement of Pan-Asianism. Contemporary scholars of Okakura viewed this as the moment of unrealized potential, that he began with this burst of Pan-Asian anti-colonial inspiration and down the line sort of petered out, became too concerned with Japanese nationalism. What I would point out is that even in the ideals of the East, Okakura is unflaggingly Japanese nationalist. He may believe that the Himalayas divide only to accentuate two mighty civilizations, those being India and China, but the ultimate realization of Asiatic thought inheritance takes place in Japan. As he continues to work through these two critiques, the tension between those two spaces becomes more and more. And so that's what a lot of critics have honed in on, and which I would sort of take issue with, simplifying a little bit. Right, before I get to the next quote. So to stick with Pan-Asianism, Pan-Africanism for a moment, Fanon does not find Pan-Africanism tenable as a long-term strategy. Ultimately, Fanon writes, the difference between the experience of African-American blacks in the United States and that of black Africans in Nigeria, say, are different experiences. And so insisting on a pan-African vision that accounts for every diasporic experience cannot be productive. This was, I would submit, a fairly ballsy thing to say at the Second Congress of Black Writers and Artists in Rome. So to keep going, Fanon then writes, the next stage for the colonized intellectual, at the very moment when he undertakes a work of art, fails to realize he is using techniques and a language borrowed from the occupier. He is content to cloak these instruments in a style which is meant to be national, but which is strangely reminiscent of exoticism. As the colonized intellectual begins to formulate this anti-colonial argument, it strikes Fanon's ear as being very reminiscent, very similar to the exoticism that is part of what Edward Said talks about in Orientalism, part of this knowledge production procedure that enables colonialism to begin with. And so I think it's interesting to look at the image. This is Kakuzo Okakura in 1905 in the United States. This is a picture that appears of him in an American newspaper. And you can see that he is dressed very self-consciously in what we would call, Japanese clothing. He's intentionally trying to portray himself as the Oriental sage. He's trying to embody this stereotype. This is where his career sort of settles down. He is a Japanese art historian. He what Fanon is calling exoticism is what Okakura spends his life in pursuit of. He is looking for what is special, what is essential about Japanese art that distinguishes it, that makes Japan worthy of consideration in the Congress of Nations on the level of the United States or Europe, right? And so ultimately, Fanon concludes on national culture by saying, national culture is no folklore where an abstract populism is convinced it has uncovered the popular truth. National culture is the collective. Through a process of, I'm sorry, I think I must have misquoted there. Collective thought process. Thank you. Collective thought process of a people to describe, justify, and extol the actions whereby they have joined forces and remain strong. The ultimate step for the colonized intellectual is political engagement in the nation against colonialism. This would have been awkward for Okakura since by the time he writes the Book of Tea in 1906, Japan has become a colonial power. Who is he supposed to organize against? All right, that's it. Thanks.
Okay, well, I would like you to join me in once more congratulating all these fine young scholars on their excellent work. We have some time, I believe. I don't have a clock in front of me, but I think we have some time to take some questions. So I'm going to ask the students to come up to the front. I'm going to finagle a little bit with the technology and get the lights up. And for those of you who are in the audience, help yourself to some more refreshments as we get people arranged.
We'll start. First of all, excellent work. Some of you, I know these projects more closely because you're also in the literature capstone, but everybody, fabulous work. I just, one question for Jacqueline. This is kind of on behalf of the belated Ben Russelback, who, was very involved in that questioning the idea of the Greek. The Greeks as white. He was going to present, in fact, at the recent conference on the idea of how the painting of the sculptures and their whitewashing, their loss of the painting, has made us, think of the Greeks as a white culture. Did you get into it at all, thinking about the kind of the ways in which we conceive of them racially because of the not being painted, or did any of your research get into that area? Because he used to talk about this. Fascinating.
Actually, interestingly enough, in terms of time, I just kind of cut it out of my presentation, but a modern view actually of a lot of the way that these ancient sculptures are being interpreted and used today is actually white supremacists do use them to say, look at these ancient cultures. Even they understood that white was the ultimate. And I think it just shows even more of their ignorance to not understand. I mean, they are making such a false claim, they makes them look even stupider. But I think it's interesting how that can be how that is something that is able to be attributed to the sculptures. But I think it's also interesting that even looking at some of the sculptures, like the actual facial depictions of the different people being portrayed, you can see that they are taking into account different racial ethnicities. You're able to see just with the way the the face is depicted. That even though it's not fully painted even today, you can see there are different racial representations throughout these marbles. I hope that answers.
Yeah, no.
Other questions?
Isabella, thank you for that. That image was just amazing. I'm not familiar with that. In terms of the objectification of the dwarves, were they like slaves? Were they technically possessions, or were they more like a member of the court, like a musician would be?
It pretty much depended on the family. In this situation, obviously Morgante was treated a lot more like family than an average court dwarf would. However, there was another person, Isabella d'Este of Mantua. She had a lot of dwarves as well, and she prioritized them, and she created different apartments for them. She loved them too, but the difference was they were her pets pretty much. They were her possessions. Once one went, she easily was able to replace and get another one, whereas with Morgante and Cosimo, it was a lot harder for him to let go of Morgante once he passed away.
Other questions?
This is for Aaron. I noticed, so in the time frames, it looks like Walcott only served one term in the Senate.
Yes.
So I'd like to think, was he turned out on his ear because of his policies, or were there other reasons for his not serving more than one term?
So, unfortunately, so he is elected in the worst crisis our nation has had to deal with. And he's voted out along with scores of other Republicans in Congress because people are fed up by the Republican non-reaction to the crisis. So he's unlucky in that, but his voting record shows his support of Hooverite policies of associationalism that just can't address the issue of the Great Depression.
I just have a few questions for a few of you. So with Christina, so you were talking about manhood. Not familiar with the Age of Innocence. It was very interesting to hear about it. I was gonna ask you about. So you talk about the protagonist losing his manhood, but the woman, one of them, the Michelle Pfeiffer woman, kind of gaining, her manhood in a way. But so I was curious for you, and maybe you can speak to this in terms of how exactly you were defining manhood. So I understand that perhaps you're thinking about manhood, in terms of the literary tradition, which is that, it's kind of a self-made man and, all of that, more independent and so on and so forth. But, manhood, especially in the context of like the Victorian 19th century, manhood is there's a certain amount, like a gentleman, right? That's a very different kind of manhood. And a gentleman is somebody who has manhood that is very focused on convention and on upholding order and on upholding, whatever is the social convention in a way. So, when you sort of talk about the flip towards the end, when he does not go toward, the Michelle Pfeiffer character, he sticks with tradition, use that as evidence to say that he lost his manhood. But, if you think of manhood in a different way, then perhaps that's not quite losing his manhood. So, do you see what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
So that's your question, okay? And then Camille, I think it might help to talk a little bit about, the social media and how, you talk about quality and quantity, right? And we heard a lot about the quantity, especially when social media there's a proliferation. There is, greater emphasis on the extent of coverage and so on and so forth. But the quality, then how does social media in, really specific platforms of social media shift the quality of those imagery? That'd be nice to hear about as well. Isabella, in terms of dwarfism, I was interested just to hear your thoughts because I wasn't getting it very clearly in terms of whether dwarfism was an outlier of disabilities in general or whether dwarfism was representative of disability. So, was there something very special about being a dwarf that was very different from being physically disabled in other ways? So, because you're, so just if, we could hear you on that. And then the last thing was in terms of Erin, I think, you might want to connect, if you want to keep working on this, you might want to connect also then, you talk about progressive republicanism and, the fact that Walcott was a Hooverite in some ways, and then you talk about welfare reform in 1996, but you want to connect it to the fact that actually after the late 1970s, you talk about conservative ascendance with Reagan and all of that. And the welfare reform part is just a part of conservative ascendance. And that conservative ascendance is very symptomatic and resonates with Hooverism and so on and so forth with the party. So just, that's not a question, that's just
It's good to know. Okay, so what I was trying to get at was the fact that Warden is she's defining manhood in terms of the literary tradition. So he is the self-made man. He's portrayed as a hero. The women sort of represent like the feminine frontiers that he's conquering. It's very grounded in what the American tradition is. But what I'm saying is that, the jurors didn't read her work critically enough. They didn't understand Warden. She believed in Otto Weineger's belief that there was a different sort of manhood. The idea that you have to be mentally, morally free. He doesn't really believe in social conventions. It's just the man should do whatever he wants. He can do whatever he wants. He's just so dominant that it doesn't matter. He believes that man is something and woman is literally nothing. And that because of this, that's why he doesn't understand woman, even though he is meant to form her. And in this way, like, she's ultimately critiquing Newland because, yes, he looks like he's the idealized American hero, but in reality, according to Weineger, he's not heedless to tradition like Ellen is. He's stuck to his conventions, and ultimately because of that, in the eyes of Weineger and in the eyes of Warden, that would make him not a man. Ultimately, it's poking fun at what the traditional American hero is.
Oh, hi. Right, so for quality, in terms of social media, I specifically focused on Instagram because Instagram is a cross between print and broadcast media, essentially. So you have the broadcast element of the photographs, but then you also have the captions. And in terms of Instagram, it is surpassing Facebook almost at the moment and is even owned by Facebook. So there it's kind of it's a conglomerate, it's a monopoly. But with the image quality that, if you guys remember, those are striking, beautiful images. And that is because the brain registers visual aids and imagery a lot faster, and people who develop these apps are very smart, so they know that people are swiping through very quickly versus reading the captions. And that is problematic when it comes to news, because when you see, you know, that first image of the New York Times and these refugees, they're fleeing, and it shows the drastic, dire situation they're in, that's great quality. And you might not read the caption, that's okay, because then it's kind of lost. But then if you look to UNHCR and you look at that quality of the image, and they're beautiful and they're happy and they're positive, and you get two totally different ideas of what these individuals are actually facing. And that common thread goes throughout Instagram, it goes throughout Facebook, and it goes throughout Twitter. Definitely this is something you could write a book on. It is also UNHCR just started their kind of qualitative approach to Instagram in the past 2 years. So it's really new research. A lot of people have researched Facebook because it's been around longer. So hopefully my research can add to that, but it's definitely something that we just have to kind of monitor as we go forth, and as you know, new apps keep coming out and new changes keep taking place to the social media sphere. So really, in terms of quality for Instagram, it's the images and showing that drastic kind of change.
The reason that I ended up choosing dwarves was because originally I would have loved to have chosen somebody with a mental disability. However, from that era, it's extremely difficult to find any type of work that discusses a certain individual consistently. So then that shifted me more towards a physical disability. And with physical disability, it seemed that a lot of literature and a lot of artwork depicted dwarves. And dwarves in particular stood out to me because during the Renaissance, especially during like the Medici court, such as Morgante, yes, they were still considered others, but out of all of the individuals that did have physical disabilities, they were the first group of people that started to shift away from that stereotype that they are such others, if that makes any sense. In the sense of people started to realize that they actually are human beings, and Cosimo, the way they treated Morgante, showed that.
First, I want to congratulate everybody on really great presentations and great work this year. My question is for JP. I do not know anything about Okakura, but I was very intrigued by the presentation, and I like the way that you applied the sort of the anti-colonial reading onto him. But you end your presentation with sort of a hat tip to Japanese empire and nationalism as well. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about that other side as well that you sort of mentioned briefly.
So Okakura is a product of Meiji Japan, and it's incredible. Between 1854 and 1871, Japan centralizes its government, disarms the samurai, institutes universal education, institutes a universal draft. If Donald Trump came out tomorrow, abolished the House of Representatives, repealed the Second Amendment, and changed the national language to Spanish, he'd still be behind the Meiji Emperor in terms of political upheaval. So there's all this stuff going on, and all of it is based on these Western models. All of it is based on the idea of catching up to the West, that Japan is a great nation, and because it's a great nation, it should be able to beat the West at its own game. And so when we get to the end of Okakura's life, when there is this sort of tilt, Okakura was not prepared for it, I want to argue. There's sentences in the Book of Tea, which is sort of the primary source that I'm studying most intently, where this dissonance comes out. So there's one in particular where he talks about that the West has only started to recognize Japan since it began to commit slaughter on Manchurian battlefields. Which is not, I think, how your prototypical nationalist describes the military conquests of his home country. So there is this shift, And then, I mean, I don't really know quite where it goes. He passes away in 1913. In the 1930s, he gets claimed by a lot of Japanese nationalists, saying, look, here's a guy who understood, you know, way back when, that Japan was this really prominent, powerful nation, and then sort of made all these justifications for Japanese fascism. And then for a long while after the war, he was sort of radioactive. Japanese scholars wouldn't study him except to problematize him. And now there's sort of been a move to bring him back. Yeah.
Yeah, let's return to this issue of Japanese. I'm having a little bit of a difficulty drawing a straight line between the idea of a colonized intellectual in Japan in this period and a colonized intellectual in, say, the Congo. In fact, Japan was never colonized. And from 1895 on was a colonizing nation. Right? It occupied Taiwan, it occupied Korea, it occupied Manchuria. It began World War II in 1931, September 1931, by the invasion of Manchuria. And Japan has had an idea of its self-position since its earliest written history. Right? They go back to the time of Shikoku, or even before. The earliest, the Wei Dynasty annals concerning Japan was that of a group of piratical dwarfs. And so it's a little difficult for me to draw a direct line between that kind of self-representation that Japan has had, first defeated in its history in 1945, between that and what happened in the Congo, or what happened in the Caribbean, or what happened in Brazil, or South America.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is what I get for kind of jumping in the middle of the presentation. No, that's right. So Japan is never formally colonized in this period that I'm talking about. So for me, what is colonial is not any particular political or military presence in Japan. What is colonial is this sort of posture of the Meiji Empire, or the Meiji regime, that what we need to do is imitate the West. What we need to do is learn from Western models, so that, and the point of what I was trying to draw out with Fanon and Okakura is that this sort of thing that post-colonial theorists talk about with a colonized mind and with you know, the sort of leftover remnants of colonization in affecting how people are able to conceive of the nation, that becomes present in the way Okakura conceives of Japan, that becomes present in the way that the intellectuals around him conceive of the country. And it's never one or the other. There's this constant push and pull, and so even in Okakura's writings, he talks about, you know, we're the proud nation that has never, you know, bent the knee to a foreign power, which is true, except that he's writing that particular sentence in English for an audience in Boston, who he's hoping will buy his book. So I think there's layers, I think, but no, correct.
So his immediate predecessor is going to be exactly that happened during the time of the Isuka and the Nara period, in which Japan was appropriating all kinds of technology from China and Korea. And so there is a 1,300-year history about this, and they were writing in Chinese and speaking Chinese to the Chinese and telling them that they weren't going to bow down to the Chinese. And so go back 1,300 years, you're going to find immediate echoes of that in Japanese history.
I think that's so interesting, because the way that he conceives of these, right, he writes these art historical things, and he says, oh, the art of the Nara period, of course, what was so important here is that Buddhism made its way into, you know, across the ocean into Japan, and that inspired all of the art. And it's about Buddhism, right? It's from China, but it's about Buddhism, because later Japan is going to make Buddhism really Buddhist, which is to say it's going to make it Japanese Buddhism.
Well, as we can see, scholars never tire of talking with other scholars, and it's a testament to all of your good work, and not just for these presentations, but really throughout the year. We've been lucky to have you in the seminar. I know the faculty probably join me in that, and so we wish you congratulations, and we hope you will stick around right now and have some more food and some more chat, but also come back and see us and let us know how things go for you from here. Thanks.